You don't belong here. The voice was sharp, a sliver of ice on a sweltering summer day. It sliced through the murmur of arriving guests, a sound so perfectly pitched in its condescension that it turned heads. The woman who spoke was a vision in white silk and lace, her hair a cascade of carefully styled brown waves, her face a mask of bridal perfection. This was Isabella Thorne, and this was her day. Her eyes, cold as polished stone, were fixed on a young woman standing hesitantly by the ornate wrought iron gates. The target of her scorn wore a faded denim jacket over a simple gray shirt, her hands shoved deep into her pockets, as if to hide them from view. She was a smudge of gray against a canvas of pastel silks and crisp tuxedos. "I'm sorry," the young woman said, her voice soft, almost lost in the breeze. I need to see him. Just for a moment." Isabella let out a laugh that was more of a brittle exhalation. "See him? See Kwon Dae-hyun? On his wedding day? Look at you. You look like you crawled out of a ditch." "Security," she called, her voice rising with theatrical indignation. Two guards in immaculate black suits moved forward, their faces impassive. "Please," the young woman Amelia pleaded, taking a hesitant step forward. Her eyes were wide, filled with a desperate, unnamed urgency that she herself didn't understand. I think my name is Amelia. I just need to ask him something." "It's important." Isabella's smile was a weapon. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder and more humiliating than her shout had been. "Listen to me, you pathetic stray. You are nothing. A piece of trash blown in by the wind. Do you have any idea who he is?" "Who I am?" "We are closing a deal today worth more than you and everyone you've ever known. This isn't a soup kitchen. Now get out of my sight before I have you thrown out so hard you forget what little name you think you have." The crowd was a ring of curious, judging eyes. Phones were already emerging, small black mirrors capturing the beautifully cruel bride and the bewildered, poorly dressed girl. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on Amelia, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt a phantom pain, a flicker of a memory of another voice, a deep and gentle one, whispering her name with love, not contempt. It was a ghost of a feeling, and it was the only thing keeping her standing. "Just let me see his face," she whispered, more to herself than to the bride. "Please." Isabella's face contorted with rage. "Security, get this filth away from my wedding." As the guards reached for her arms, a sudden silence fell over the courtyard. A new presence had emerged from the grand villa. He moved with an unnatural stillness, a man who commanded gravity itself. Kwon Dae-hyun, impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, stood on the marble steps, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His face was a study in cold control, a handsome, unreadable mask that had intimidated rivals and soothed investors for years. His eyes, dark and empty since the day the sea had swallowed his world, finally landed on the girl in the denim jacket. For a single, eternal second, nothing happened. Then the mask cracked. 5 years earlier, that mask had not existed. Kwon Dae-hyun had been a man who smiled, a man whose laughter echoed through the sprawling, minimalist mansion that felt more like a home than a fortress. The source of that transformation was Amelia. She had walked into his life not as a business associate or a sycophant, but as a curator for a gallery he had acquired, her passion for art and her complete indifference to his reputation disarming him instantly. She was an African-American woman from a world away, a scholar of beauty who saw the quiet, lonely man behind the formidable empire of the Pictet Syndicate. Their love was a secret garden in a world of concrete and steel. He would come home from meetings where men trembled at his name, and she would be waiting, not with fear, but with a teasing question about his day, her hand reaching for his, grounding him. She filled his silent, echoing halls with jazz music and the scent of the orchids she insisted on keeping in his dark office. "You need more life in here," she would say, her fingers tracing the cold glass of his desk. All this power, and you live like a ghost. He had given her everything, a world of impossible luxury, but she only ever seemed to want him. She learned a few phrases in Korean, her accent clumsy and charming, and he would correct her with a soft smile, his hand in her hair. He was the boss of the Korean Mafia, a man whose orders could shift economies and end lives, but with her, he was just Dae-hyun. And she was his Amelia, his heart, his unlikely, brilliant piece. Then came the day of the storm. They were driving along the coastal highway, the sky a churning canvas of bruised purple and gray. The sea raged beside them, throwing spray against the windows of the armored sedan. Amelia was talking, her voice a warm counterpoint to the howling wind, her hand resting on his thigh. He remembered turning to look at her, the way the dim light caught the curve of her smile. That was his last clear memory before the world exploded. A truck, appearing from nowhere, slammed into them with the force of a battering ram. The screech of metal, the shattering of glass, the violent, sickening lurch as their car was forced over the cliffside. It tumbled through the air, a broken toy against the fury of the ocean. He remembered the impact with the water, the sudden, crushing cold, and the horrifying silence where her voice had been. He was pulled from the sinking wreckage by his trailing security team, bleeding and broken, his consciousness fading as he screamed her name into the storm. They searched for weeks. Divers, hélicoptère, boat. They found pieces of the car, a shred of her silk scarf tangled in the rocks, but they never found her. The sea, they said, was unforgiving. It had taken her. Kwon Dae-hyun, the man who controlled everything, had lost the only thing that mattered. The cold mask he wore now was forged in the icy waters of that day, a permanent fixture over the hollowed-out ruin of his heart. The years that followed were a long, gray emptiness. Dae-hyun moved through his life like a phantom, his grief a constant, silent companion. The Picta Syndicate grew even more powerful under his cold, precise leadership. He was more ruthless, more decisive, his capacity for mercy seemingly drowned along with his wife. The warmth she had brought into his world vanished, replaced by an intimidating, sterile order. His mansion became a museum of loss. Her side of the bed remained untouched, the sheets crisp and cold. Her art books sat on the shelves, gathering a fine layer of dust that no housekeeper was ever permitted to clean. He would sometimes stand in the doorway of her old studio, the scent of dried paint and turpentine a ghostly echo of her presence, and feel nothing but a vast, crushing weight. Min-jun, his most trusted lieutenant and the closest thing he had to a friend, watched the transformation with a heavy heart. He saw the light in his boss's eyes die, replaced by a permanent, chilling darkness. "You must find a way to move forward, Hyungnim," Min-jun had said once, using the respectful term for an older brother. "This is not living. It is a long suicide." Dae-hyun had simply stared out at the city lights, his jaw tight. "I am alive. That is enough," but it wasn't. A year after the accident, yielding to the pressure of tradition and the need for some form of closure, he agreed to a symbolic funeral. An ornate casket, beautiful and heartbreakingly empty, was lowered into the ground in the family's private cemetery overlooking the sea. He stood stoically as tributes were spoken, his face unmoving, but as the first handful of dirt was thrown, something inside him finally shattered. He didn't weep. He simply walked away from the ceremony, back to his car, and had himself driven to the coast where she was lost. He stood on the cliff's edge for hours, the wind whipping at his suit, until Min-jun gently guided him away, afraid his boss might follow his heart into the abyss. That day marked a turning point. The raw, open wound of his grief began to scar over, hardening into something cold and impenetrable. He stopped visiting her studio. He allowed the housekeepers to finally clean the dust from her books. He was sealing her away, entombing her memory in a place so deep inside himself that it could no longer hurt him. He was building a fortress, not of walls and guards, but of pure, unadulterated emptiness. He had concluded that love was a vulnerability, a fatal flaw in the architecture of power. He would never make that mistake again. The world saw him as more powerful than ever, a king on a throne of ice. Only Minjun knew the truth. The king was a prisoner, and his kingdom was a grave. Into this carefully constructed void stepped Isabella Thorne. She was the daughter of Jonathan Thorne, ruthless American corporate titan whose shipping empire was teetering on the brink of collapse. A strategic alliance with Dae-hyun's logistical network was his only salvation. The proposed merger was not one of companies, but of families. Isabella was the centerpiece of the deal. She was intelligent, beautiful, and possessed a chilling ambition that Dae-hyun recognized because it mirrored his own, albeit a shallower version. She understood the language of power, of assets, and leverage. When they first met, she looked at him not with the awe or fear he was accustomed to, but with the cool appraisal of a partner assessing a valuable acquisition. She saw the emptiness in him, the hollow space where Amelia had been, and correctly identified it as an opportunity. "Your home is beautiful, Mr. Kwan," she had said during her first visit, her eyes scanning the grand, impersonal rooms. "But it lacks a woman's touch. It feels unlived in." The comment was audacious, a direct acknowledgement of the ghost in the room, but it was delivered with such confidence that it bordered on respect. She wasn't afraid of Amelia's memory. She was planning to pave over it. Over the following months, she began her careful campaign. She didn't push, she suggested. A new piece of art here, a different floral arrangement there. She started by respecting the shrine to his late wife, then slowly, methodically, began to deconstruct it. She would talk about the future, about their combined influence, about the dynasty they could build. She never spoke of love. She spoke of legacy. For Dae-hyun, the proposal was logical. It was a good business decision. His heart was a dead thing, a fossilized relic, so it had no say in the matter. Marrying Isabella was a practical, emotionless step towards securing his future and honoring his family's expectation that he produce an heir. He felt nothing for her, but she did not require his affection, only his name and his power. She was a partner, not a soulmate. The distinction was, for him, a relief. He consented. The engagement was announced, a shockwave in the worlds of finance and underworld dealings. Isabella was triumphant. She moved through the preparations for the wedding with the precision of a general planning a campaign. She selected the venue, the dress, the guest list. She was crafting the perfect image, the ultimate power couple. Dae-hyun remained a passive observer in the planning of his own life. He had surrendered to the cold logic of his new reality. The wedding day dawned, bright and clear. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie, his reflection a stranger in a familiar suit. He was about to chain himself to a future he did not want, but it was a future. It was something other than the endless, echoing past. It was a final act of burying Amelia, of admitting defeat. It was the end of a chapter. He was wrong. It was the beginning of the real story. Amelia's world for 5 years had been a quiet, hazy dream. She awoke in a small, sterile room in a rural clinic hundreds of miles down the coast from the city, her head bandaged, her body a canvas of bruises. She knew nothing. Not her name, not her past, not the face that should have been familiar in the mirror. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia, a result of severe trauma. The fisherman who found her washed ashore, unconscious and barely breathing, had brought her there. He'd seen no crash, just a body on the sand. With no identification and no one looking for her, she became a ghost. The clinic named her Mia. It was simple, easy to hold on to. She was released after a few months with a small amount of charity funds and a life that was a blank page. She settled in the sleepy coastal town, a place of salt air and quiet routines. She worked odd jobs in a diner, a bookstore, a small local garden. She was liked for her gentle nature and her sad, distant eyes. People assumed she had a tragic past and were kind enough not to pry. Her nights were the hardest. She was haunted by fragments, sensory ghosts that had no context. The scent of a specific flower, orchids, would sometimes drift into her mind, so real she could almost touch them. She'd dream of the feeling of silk against her skin, of a deep, resonant voice speaking a language she didn't know but somehow understood. She'd wake with tears on her cheeks and a profound sense of loss for a life she couldn't remember. She carried a small, smooth stone in her pocket, something the fisherman had found clenched in her fist. It was her only link to the void. One sweltering afternoon, she was cleaning tables in the diner when a news report came on the small television mounted in the corner. It was a celebrity news segment about the wedding of the decade. A photo flashed on the screen. A handsome Korean man with impossibly sad eyes, standing next to a smiling, triumphant-looking American woman. The anchor mentioned his name. Kwon Dae-hyun. The name struck her like a physical blow. It didn't unlock her memory, but it resonated deep within her soul. A forgotten chord suddenly struck. Dae-hyun. A whisper formed on her lips, a name she hadn't known she knew. The image of his face stayed with her, imprinted on her mind. It was the face from her dreams, the man whose voice she sometimes heard. An overwhelming, illogical certainty took hold of her. She had to find him. She had to see him. It made no sense. He was a billionaire, a magnate, marrying a socialite. She was a waitress in a forgotten town. But the pull was irresistible, a magnetic force drawing her back to a life she had been stolen from. She took her meager savings, a few $100s saved in a jar, bought a bus ticket, and began the long journey. She didn't know what she would say. She didn't know what she was looking for. She only knew she had to stand in front of him, to look into his eyes, and hope that he could see the person she no longer knew how to be. The gates of the estate were more imposing than she could have imagined, a golden fortress designed to keep the world out. And now, she was the world it was keeping out. The bride's words echoed in her ears, each one a fresh wound. Pathetic stray, piece of trash, filth. The faces in the crowd swam before her, a blur of judgment and morbid curiosity. The guards' hands were firm on her arms, their touch impersonal and bruising. Amelia felt a wave of despair wash over her. This was a mistake, a crazy, hopeless impulse. She was about to be dragged away, a madwoman who had crashed a billionaire's wedding. She closed her eyes, a silent surrender. And then the silence. The pressure on her arms vanished. The murmuring of the crowd died. She opened her eyes and saw that the guards had frozen, their gazes fixed on the villa behind her. The bride, Isabella, had a look of pure shock on her face, her perfect mask of contempt momentarily forgotten. Amelia turned slowly. And there he was, Kwon Dae-hyun. He was just as he looked on the television, but infinitely more real. The sadness in his eyes was a vast, dark ocean. He stood on the steps, a statue carved from grief and power. His eyes swept the scene, first landing on Isabella, then the guards, and finally on her. Time seemed to slow, to stretch into a thick, syrupy stillness. His gaze passed over her, dismissive at first, another problem to be handled. But it snagged. It came back. His head tilted slightly, a flicker of confusion in his cold expression. He took a step down, then another, his eyes locked on her face. The world seemed to fade away until it was only the two of them, separated by 20 yards of pristine gravel and 5 years of hell. He saw the denim jacket and the worn-out shirt, but he also saw the way she held her head, the specific curve of her jaw. He saw the small, faint scar above her right eyebrow, a tiny white line from a childhood fall she'd told him about one night. He saw her eyes, the same eyes that had looked at him with a love so pure it had terrified him. The cold, impenetrable fortress he had built around his heart did not just crack, it was obliterated. All the air left his lungs in a ragged, silent gasp. Isabella, sensing the catastrophic shift in the universe, rushed to his side. Dae-hyun, darling, don't worry about this. Security is handling the trash, but he didn't hear her. He didn't see her. He only saw the ghost that had haunted his every waking moment, now standing before him in flesh and blood. His lips parted, and a single word, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years, escaped like a prayer, a question, a statement of impossible fact. Amelia? The name hung in the air, a sonic boom in the dead silence. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Hearing him say it, in that voice, the deep, resonant voice from her dreams, was like a key turning in a lock deep inside her mind. A dam broke. Images, feelings, sensations flooded her. The scent of orchids. The feel of his hand in hers. Laughter in a sunlit garden. The roar of the sea. Dae-hyun pushed past a stunned Isabella, shoving a guard aside who dared to stand in his way. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, his movements no longer controlled, but driven by a desperate, primal need. He stopped inches from her, his hands coming up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as if to confirm she was real. Tears, the tears he hadn't shed at her funeral, streamed down his face. "It's you," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and adoration. "You're alive. Amelia, you're alive," and he pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, holding her with a strength that was both fierce and fragile, a man clinging to a miracle. The crowd of wedding guests stood in stunned silence, their phones forgotten, witnesses to the impossible resurrection of a dead woman and the utter demolition of a wedding. The world outside the gates of Kwon Dae-hyun's estate erupted. The wedding, so meticulously planned by Isabella, was over before it began. She was quietly, yet firmly, escorted from the property, her face a thunderous mask of fury and utter humiliation. The official statement released to the press was curt. The wedding has been postponed due to a private family matter, but the videos had already gone viral. Grainy mobile phone footage showed the powerful Kwon Dae-hyun, a man known for his icy composure, weeping as he embraced a shabbily dressed woman. The story was irresistible. Speculation ran rampant. Inside the mansion, the chaos of the outside world was a distant hum. Dae-hyun led Amelia through the vast, silent halls. For her, it was a strange and alien landscape of marble floors and soaring glass walls. For him, it was a house that was suddenly, miraculously, a home again. He sat with her in a quiet sitting room, never letting go of her hand, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. He asked her questions gently, piecing together the fractured narrative of her last 5 years. Her amnesia, the life she'd lived as Mia, the news report that had inexplicably drawn her to him. "I didn't know why," she explained, her voice trembling. I saw your face, and I felt like I was supposed to be here. I felt like I knew you." Dae-hyun's heart ached with a mixture of profound joy and simmering rage. Joy that she was alive, that this impossible dream was real. Rage at the years that had been stolen from them, at the suffering she had endured alone. While he cocooned Amelia in safety, Isabella and her father, Jonathan Thorne, launched their counterattack. They couldn't let the narrative be about a miraculous return. It had to be about a scam. They fed a story to their contacts in the tabloid press. The headlines were brutal. Desperate vagrant scams grieving billionaire. Wedding crashers shocking con. They painted Amelia as a cunning opportunist, a grifter who had studied Dae-hyun's tragic past and concocted an elaborate scheme to impersonate his dead wife. They leaked anonymous quotes from people in the town where she'd lived, twisting her quiet, gentle nature into proof of her being a secretive, manipulative loner. The public, always hungry for a scandal, began to doubt. The romantic story of a lost love found was tainted by the more cynical and perhaps more believable tale of a massive fraud. Dae-hyun was furious. He watched the news reports, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. "They are trying to bury you again," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned to Min-jun, who had been standing by, a silent sentinel. I want to know everything. I want to know who is behind these stories, and I want you to find the truth of what happened 5 years ago. Every detail. Tear it all apart. I don't care who you have to break. Find it, Minjun simply bowed his head. Yes, Youngnim, the battle lines were drawn. It was no longer just about a personal reunion. It was a war for Amelia's identity, for her honor, and for the truth that had been submerged for 5 long years. Dae-hyun would shield her from the storm, but he would also unleash a hurricane of his own on those who dared to harm her. He would remind the world that while his heart had been broken, his power had not. Minjun began his work with a silent, methodical efficiency that made him Dae-hyun's most feared asset. He didn't start with the tabloids. That was a war of whispers and lies. He started with the cold, hard facts of the past. He pulled the original police reports and internal investigation files from the crash 5 years ago. At the time, it had been ruled a tragic accident caused by the storm, a conclusion that a grief-stricken Dae-hyun had accepted. But now, with fresh eyes, Minjun saw the cracks. The first inconsistency was the truck driver. The police report stated the truck had been stolen and was later found abandoned, the driver never identified. But Minjun's sources in the police department, men who owed Dae-hyun their careers, found the original, unedited incident log. It mentioned a witness who saw the driver climb out of the truck and get into a dark sedan that had been waiting a quarter mile down the road. That detail had never made it to the final report. It wasn't an accident. It was an attack. The next target was the sole survivor from Dae-hyun's security detail in the follow car, a man named Park Jin-woo. The official story was that Park had suffered career-ending injuries and retired to a quiet life in the countryside. Minjun's digital trackers found him in less than 12 hours. He wasn't living a quiet life. He was living a wealthy one in Busan under a new name, funded by a series of anonymous wire transfers that had begun a week after the crash. Minjun didn't send a team of thugs. He went himself, arriving at Park's luxury apartment with 2 unassuming men. Park opened the door, and his face went white with a terror that 5 years hadn't managed to erase. He knew who Minjun was. He knew who he worked for. "We need to talk about the accident, Mr. Park," Minjun said, his voice calm, almost gentle, which was far more terrifying than any threat. They sat in Park's minimalist living room. Park trembled, sweating, stammering that he didn't remember anything. Minjun simply placed a tablet on the coffee table, showing Park's new identity, his bank statements, and a live satellite feed of his daughter's elementary school playground. "Your memory may be gone, but mine is excellent," Minjun said softly. "Kwon Dae-hyun is a patient man, but his grief has made him thorough. He wants the truth. All of it. And he will have it. That was all it took." The carefully constructed lies of Park's new life crumbled. He confessed, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt and fear. The attack had been orchestrated by the Yongsan clan, a rival syndicate Dae-hyun had been systematically dismantling. They had paid him to lag behind, to give the truck a clear shot. But that wasn't the whole story. As he arrived at the crash scene, just before the car went into the water, he saw something else. It wasn't a rescuer. Park choked out, his face slick with tears. The car was hanging on the edge of the cliff. The driver's side was crushed, but the passenger door was jammed open. She had been thrown partway out. She was alive. "I saw her move," he paused, taking a shuddering breath. Then a man appeared. He wasn't one of ours. He was dressed in black, like a paramedic, but he had no gear. He checked on her, then he pulled her out of the car and carried her away into the woods. A moment later, the car finally broke free and plunged into the sea. "I was told to say she went down with the vehicle. I was paid to disappear and to keep my mouth shut." Minjun's blood ran cold. Amelia hadn't been lost to the sea. She had been taken. Someone had wanted her gone, but not necessarily dead. Someone had wanted Dae-hyun to believe she was dead. The conspiracy was far deeper and more personal than a simple gangland hit. The revelation that Amelia had been abducted from the crash site changed everything. A simple gang hit was impersonal. This was a calculated act of psychological warfare. Minjun's focus immediately shifted. Who would benefit most from Daehyun being not just attacked, but emotionally destroyed? The Yongsen clan wanted him dead, but this level of cruelty suggested a different kind of enemy. The trail led Minjun to the money. The fake paramedic who took Amelia would have been a professional, expensive. He started digging into the finances of everyone who had risen in prominence in the 5 years since Daehyun's world collapsed. He cross-referenced payments made to shell corporations known for private security and discreet services, and then he found it. A single, massive payment of $2 million transferred from a subsidiary of Thorn Industries to a shadowy firm based in Macau, 1 week after the crash. The authorization code for the transfer belonged to Jonathan Thorn. The motive was clear. Jonathan Thorn's company was already failing 5 years ago. He needed Daehyun's help, but Daehyun, happily married, had no reason to form such a tight, familial alliance. With Amelia gone, Daehyun became a broken, empty vessel, a perfect target for a man like Thorn to fill with his own ambitions, using his daughter as the key. But Minjun knew that Jonathan, for all his ruthlessness, was a corporate shark, not a mastermind of this kind of personal cruelty. The final piece of the puzzle had to be Isabella. Minjun's team hacked into her personal records, her emails, her deleted files. They found encrypted messages between her and the head of the Macau security firm. The instructions were explicit. The target of the hit, Daehyun, was to be neutralized. But the collateral, Amelia, was to be handled differently. Do not make her a martyr, one of Isabella's messages read. A ghost is more useful. Ensure she disappears. No body. No memory. Just an absence. Daehyun sat in his office, the evidence laid out on his desk by Minjun. The cold fury in his eyes was terrifying to behold. He didn't explode. He became unnaturally calm. He sent for Isabella. She arrived, still defiant, believing she could talk her way out of the misunderstanding of the canceled wedding. She walked into his office, ready to perform. Daehyun, we need to talk. My father and I are being slandered. She stopped when she saw his face. The emptiness she had once seen as an opportunity was now filled with something ancient and lethal. He didn't speak. He simply slid the tablet across the desk. On it were her emails, the wire transfer confirmations, Park's signed confession. Isabella's charismatic facade evaporated. Her skin went pale. Her breath hitched. This is fake. It's fabricated, she stammered, her voice losing its polished edge. Is it? Daehyun's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, yet it filled the room with menace. You didn't want her dead. You wanted me broken. You wanted me empty so you could move in and decorate. Isabella's fear curdled into venomous rage, the last defense of the guilty. She never deserved you, she spat, her composure shattering completely. She was a nobody, a little charity case you picked up. I gave you a future, an empire. He was never going to love me as long as your ghost was around. I moved the ghost. I put her where she belonged, in obscurity. You should be thanking me. In that moment, Daehyun saw the true, monstrous ugliness of her ambition. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the gardens where Amelia was now walking, her steps still hesitant but her face turned toward the sun. He pressed a button on his desk. Minjun. Let them in. The doors to the office opened, and 2 uniformed police detectives, accompanied by a senior prosecutor, walked in. Isabella stared at them, her mouth agape in horror. The prosecutor looked from the evidence on the desk to Isabella's panicked face. Isabella Thorn, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. As they cuffed her, her final, desperate shriek echoed in the hall, a sound of utter and complete ruin. Justice had arrived, not with a bang, but with the cold, quiet click of handcuffs. The final act of the drama played out not in secret meetings or shadowy confrontations, but in the stark, public arena of a courtroom. The trial of Isabella and Jonathan Thorne became an international media sensation, a spectacle of fallen power and shocking depravity. The prosecution, armed with Min Jun's impeccably gathered evidence, laid out the conspiracy in chilling detail. Park Jin-woo, granted immunity for his testimony, recounted the events of the crash, his voice trembling as he described seeing Amelia taken. Financial experts traced the money from Thorne Industries to the Macau firm. Digital forensic specialists presented Isabella's own words, her encrypted emails laying bare her cruel and calculated plan. The defense tried to paint it as a corporate smear, a fabrication by a powerful man to escape a marriage he no longer wanted. They attacked Amelia's amnesia, suggesting she was an unreliable witness to her own life, perhaps even a willing participant in a long con. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the quiet dignity of the people they were trying to destroy. Amelia took the stand. She didn't have to recount the details of the crime. She didn't remember them. She simply had to be herself. Dressed in a simple but elegant dress provided by Daehyun, she spoke softly about her 5 years as Mia, the fragmented dreams, the sense of loss, the inexplicable pull that led her back to him. She wasn't a victim seeking vengeance. She was a woman trying to reclaim her stolen soul. Her quiet strength and vulnerability were more powerful than any accusation. The most damning moment, however, came from Daehyun himself. When he took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He wasn't the feared mafia boss or the ruthless CEO. He was a man describing the love of his life. He spoke of Amelia, of the light she brought into his world, and then he described the 5 years of darkness that followed her disappearance. His testimony wasn't for the jury. It was a eulogy for a life that had been stolen and a testament to a love that had survived even death. "They did not just try to kill my wife," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion, his eyes fixed on Isabella. "They tried to kill my soul. They buried her alive in my memory. They built their future on her grave. The verdict was a formality. Guilty on all counts." Jonathan Thorne, his corporate empire in ruins, received a life sentence for his role in the conspiracy. Isabella, the architect of the cruelty, was also sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, she looked at Daehyun one last time, her eyes filled not with remorse, but with a final, impotent flare of hatred. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, then turned away, his part in her story finished forever. The justice was absolute, the scandal put to rest. But for Daehyun and Amelia, the true work was just beginning. The legal victory was an end, but their life together was a new, uncertain start. The world slowly forgot the scandal of the Thorns, moving on to the next headline. But in the quiet sanctuary of Daehyun's estate, a new, more delicate chapter was unfolding. The healing was not a sudden event, but a slow sunrise. Amelia's memory did not return in a dramatic flood, but in gentle waves, triggered by small, everyday things. The taste of a certain tea, the melody of a jazz song on the radio, the way Daehyun would look at her when he thought she wasn't watching. Each recovered fragment was a gift, a piece of her stolen past returned to her. But she was not the same woman she had been 5 years ago. Her time as Mia had forged a quiet resilience in her, a strength born of solitude and self-reliance. Daehyun, in turn, was also transformed. The icy shell he had built around his heart had melted away, but the grief had changed him. He was softer, more patient, his power now tempered with a profound appreciation for the fragility of life and happiness. He found that he was falling in love with her all over again, not just with the memory of the woman he had lost, but with the survivor who had returned, a person shaped by experiences he could only imagine. One day, he took her back to the small coastal town where she had lived as Mia. He walked with her through the familiar streets, met the people who had shown her kindness, and saw the simple, peaceful life she had built from nothing. He stood in the small, sparse apartment she had rented, and for the first time, he truly understood the depth of her strength. It was there, in that humble room, that he asked her to marry him again. "I don't want to just go back to the way things were," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I want to build something new with the woman you are now and the man you have helped me become again." Her answer was a quiet, tearful yes. Their second wedding was the opposite of the one Isabella had planned. It was a small, private ceremony in the garden of their home, the same garden where they had shared so much laughter years ago. Only their closest circle, including a grateful Minjun and the kind fisherman who had saved her, were in attendance. It wasn't a merger of empires, but a reunion of two souls who had found their way back to each other through an impossible darkness. They decided their pain had to have a purpose beyond their own happiness. They established the Amelia Kwan Foundation, a global organization dedicated to helping unidentified persons and victims of amnesia, using their vast resources to fund research, provide support, and reunite families. It was their legacy, a beacon of hope forged from their own ordeal. Years later, a visitor to the estate might see them walking in the garden at sunrise. He, the once feared leader of the underworld, now a man whose power was wielded for good. She, the once lost girl, now a woman of quiet grace and immense strength, her hand held securely in his. Their past was a part of them, a story of fire and grief, but it was no longer their prison. It was the foundation upon which they had built a new life, one more beautiful and resilient than they could have ever imagined. They were not a perfect couple from a fairy tale. They were survivors, their love a testament not to an easy life, but to the enduring power of a heart that refuses to stop searching for home.